Hello friends, our last video for this unit is the end of Reconstruction. It goes in your end of Reconstruction notes. So Reconstruction brings a lot of changes. Freedom for African Americans means a lot of different things. They can search for family members that they lost because slavery broke families apart. Slaves could now make money, buy land, have opportunities. Most of them want to learn how to read and write, want to be able to access the Bible in a whole new way through reading and writing. The Freedmen's Bureau builds schools, and we have tax-supported public schools. They put together their own trade associations, labor unions. They kind of build their own communities. Some of them moved out west to try and escape the South's discrimination, but also have opportunity out west where there's a lot more land. We'll get into that next unit. And then, of course, we've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment freed slaves. The 14th Amendment made them citizens. And the 15th Amendment helped them gain that right to vote. The problem is those liberties are not afforded to African Americans in the way that they're supposed to be. The new economic systems in the South made them more dependent. Remember, we talked about sharecropping, where they don't own the land that they're working and they don't get paid money. They get paid in whatever crops they produce. Well, what if something happens to those crops? African Americans that moved to cities were met with resistance. They were paid less than white people. Southern cities were growing, but the rural South was still full of economic issues. And white landowners didn't want to sell their land to African Americans. Sometimes they didn't want to rent land to African Americans. And so we get into a position where they aren't being given the opportunities that they were supposed to. We've looked at this cartoon before in class, but basically we have an African-American family who are cowering in fear. In the background, we've got a schoolhouse that's being burnt to the ground, an African-American that is hung from a noose in a tree. And looking over all of this is the KKK and white Southerners shaking hands. And the title of this cartoon is Worse Than Slavery. So even though they're supposed to be free and have all these rights, they don't because of the rise of the KKK and white landowners not wanting them to have those rights in the South. So we get into this era called the Jim Crow era. And when I say Jim Crow was a name for a minstrel show, a traveling performance where white actors performed in blackface. And Jim Crow is just the name for all these laws that are meant to keep African Americans as inferior and dependent. So they had their rights taken away by Southern governments after Reconstruction. Job discrimination, being paid less, sharecropping and tenant farming, intimidated out of voting, and racial violence as well, brought on by the KKK. So the African Americans are living in the South without the rights that they were promised. And one form of those rights being taken away is segregation. And there's two types of segregation, de jure and de facto. De jure means it's in the laws, it's written down, and de facto is everyone just kind of does it anyway, even though it's not written down. So at the turn of the century, both of these things are happening in the United States. In the South, a lot of laws are written in the books that segregate African Americans from whites. In the North, they're not laws written down, it's people just doing it. Staying away from African Americans, not serving them in bars and restaurants and hotels. So both of these types of segregation are happening everywhere. It's not just a Southern issue. So violence was used to keep African Americans in a dependent position, but it was also used to keep African Americans from voting, from exercising their 15th Amendment right. And there are different types of ways that white Southerners kept African Americans from voting. Poll taxes, which is where you have to pay money to vote, while African Americans had just been enslaved, so they don't have money. Literacy tests, where you had to pass a test that you could read and write before you could vote, while African Americans weren't allowed to be taught to read and write when they were enslaved. Well, what if they did have money? What if they could read and write? Then many local governments put together grandfather clauses. And grandfather clause was the idea that if your grandfather could vote, you could vote. And because these newly freedmen, their grandfathers couldn't vote, then they weren't allowed to vote. And so it really just made this system where only white people were allowed to vote. So the Jim Crow laws is the name given to laws passed by Southern legislatures to create and enforce segregation. So Jim Crow enforces segregation. And again, this isn't a person, it's a set of laws. And a good example of this is railroads. African Americans had to sit in certain railroad cars. They couldn't be in the car with white people. That's an example. In 1896, an African American breaks this law, and we get a very important Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy is his name. He is 1/8 African American, and he often passed as white, meaning he looked and appeared to be white and kind of tried to pass as a white person. He tests the law and sits on a white-only train. He is arrested. They stop the train. The police come get him, and he sues, saying that he should be allowed to sit anywhere. And the Supreme Court rules that he is considered African American because he has what they call one drop of black blood, and he wasn't allowed to sit in that rail car. And that in order to keep things fair, separate but equal facilities did not violate the 14th Amendment. Basically, legalizing segregation. Saying if people... Oh, I spelled that wrong. Sorry. Segregation. If train cars and restaurants and hotels and schools, churches want to enforce segregation, they just have to have separate but equal facilities. So schools, there can be a white school and a black school as long as they are equal. And we all know that they ended up not being equal at all, and that the facilities for African Americans were much lesser than. And so Plessy versus Ferguson legalizes segregation, makes it even more unfair for African Americans in the South. So the outcome of all this, of taking away their rights, taking away their economic freedoms, their political and social freedoms, ends up being violence against African Americans. And one form of this violence is called lynching, or a mob lynch. Or lynch mob, I guess I should put. So a lynch mob is a group of people who murder, usually by hanging someone in order to intimidate them and scare others. Between 1882 and 1892, 900 African Americans lost their lives to lynch mobs. That's almost 100 a year. And African Americans were fearful of this all the time. They were always afraid they were going to be lynched, to be killed for anything that they were supposed to be able to do. They were supposed to be able to vote. They were supposed to be able to get whatever job they want, buy property wherever they want, talk to whoever they want. But they lived in such fear of lynch mobs that they ended up not doing those things. Attempting to vote or register to vote was a very common offense, and the people that are violently murdering these African Americans, lynching them, are almost never put in jail. So there's lots of social discontent too. We know about scallywags or scoundrels were people that helped Southerners in the South. There's not many of them. Poor white farmers and merchants and landowners, a lot of people that had been hurt by Reconstruction just wanted to go back to the way it was. They wanted to restore the old political and social order where white people were in charge. So groups like the KKK became very active because they keep African Americans in a dependent position. And here's some examples of what they would do. They would burn down houses and churches. They would commit violence on African Americans trying to vote or registering to vote. They would commit violence with the Freedmen's Bureau, burn down those offices that were and schools that were supposed to help African Americans. The local governments couldn't control the violence. These white men ended up being on the juries and letting other white men who had hurt African Americans go free. And so it was just kind of like a free-for-all for white violence in the South. Technically, the Army and federal courts are supposed to punish Klan members, but it was mostly up to local governments, and it just didn't happen. So there's lots of problems with Reconstruction. It didn't do what it set out to do, protect African Americans. The North being in charge of the South isn't a good relationship. So African Americans are unhappy, Southerners are unhappy, the economy is not picking back up again. There's poor economic conditions, poor work conditions on plantations, and everyone starts to blame the Republican Party. And the Republican Party was the party that was in charge of the Reconstruction. and they kind of start, there's just discontent. They just want it to be over. They want North and South to come back together. And so there's going to be a rise of Democrats in Congress that go against those Republicans. A huge economic depression hits in the South. Government focus is pulled away from Reconstruction. Republican Congress members who were really big during Reconstruction are leaving or have died. And that there's a weakening of federal power in the slaughterhouse cases, and that's a Supreme Court decision that civil rights issues were under state control, not protected by the 14th Amendment. So basically states are supposed to protect African Americans, but they're not doing that. And people in the North are growing tired of this too. They're tired of the military being in the South. They're tired of hearing about Reconstruction and what's going on, and they just want it to end. So that's exactly what happens. In 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes is trying to become president versus Samuel Tilden, who's a Democrat. In the election, neither of them got the majority of electoral votes, so it had to be solved with a compromise. And so in this kind of like dirty deal that ends Reconstruction, Hayes promises that if he wins, he will end Reconstruction. He will withdraw federal troops from the South. And with no protection, then those local governments that were protecting African Americans completely collapse and Reconstruction ends. So it was kind of a dirty deal that ended Reconstruction. Everyone wanted it to come to an end, but African Americans were not given the rights that they were promised, and Reconstruction ended with no help to them. So the lasting impact of Reconstruction on our nation is that African Americans in the South don't get the rights that they were supposed to get. The North and South are still not agreeing on things, and the South is not rebuilt. So all of these issues lead to a country that is still divided even after the Civil War and Reconstruction has ended.